Start chapter 5. Chapter 5 is just going to go into a little bit more detail about Antebellum, Mississippi than chapter 4 did. Antebellum, Mississippi just means pre-Civil War, before the war started. This chapter is just kind of going to talk about what was going on specifically in Mississippi and our reasonings for seceding from the Union. So before the Civil War, Southerners referred to their social and cultural traditions as the Southern way of life. To most white Mississippians, Southern way of life meant living on a plantation, which were associated with wealth, social prestige, and class. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793, and it was a relatively simple machine that separated cotton fiber from cotton seeds, saving time and labor. So before the cotton gin, slaves had to manually pick out the seeds, which would take forever and was often very difficult to do. So the cotton gin was one of the most important machines in Southern history because it made it faster and easier to do that task. Like we talked about in chapter 4, we referred to cotton as King Cotton, and we were heavily reliant on cotton. And this is actually where we got our cotton seeds from. It had been known that Mexican cotton would grow well in Mississippi's climate, but Mexican officials had forbidden the exportation of cotton seeds. They wanted it for themselves. So after a visit to Mexico, a Natchez planter named Walter Burling returned with several dolls stuffed with cotton and cotton seeds. So he kind of tricked the system there. So Dr. Rush, who was a planter and a scientist, took the seeds from within the dolls and developed the Mexican petite Gulf seed. He tweaked it just a little bit to make it specific to Mississippi and Mississippi soil. And that is how cotton became prominent, and it ended up replacing tobacco, indigo, and hemp. And then we became the heartland of the Cotton Kingdom. The plantation system and the cotton economy influenced almost every aspect of life in Antebellum, Mississippi, again, pre-Civil War Mississippi. Social affairs, political affairs, and school terms were determined by cotton picking and planting seasons. Everything they did revolved around planting and farming cotton. When school year started, everything. When cotton was planted and when it was harvested determined when school would start. There were different types of planters that dealt with cotton. Large planters were slaveholders who owned 50 or more slaves and farmed at least 500 acres of land. They were a minority of Mississippians' population, however, but they dominated the state economically and socially. Most large planters were Whigs, that political party right there, Whigs, who tried to keep controversy over slavery to a minimum because they feared that continued agitation would lead to secession and war. They just wanted to keep to themselves and stay quiet so nothing threatened their wealth. There were also small planters. Small planters owned between 20 and 50 slaves and farmed between 200 and 500 acres. So that's still a lot of slaves and a lot of land back then, but they were just referred to as small planters. They were Democrats who felt threatened by the abolitionist movement. They supported the expansion of slavery, obviously, because that meant that it would make them possible to acquire more land. So the more land that United States got out west, the more slave states it would pop up, which that meant they could buy and own more land that could have slaves. Then there are farmers. Farmers, small farmers, own less than 20 slaves and farm less than 200 acres of land. They made up the largest group of slave owners in Mississippi, and because of their numbers, they were a powerful political force during the 1850s. There were so many small farmers back then that they had the most say because they had the most numbers. As far as education was concerned, we talked about how cotton picking and harvesting determined when school ran, but farming required little formal education, so there was little demand for a public school system just to begin with. Tutors, private teachers were hired for children of planters, so they could just stay at home and be tutored from there. Many people believe that women in the Old South were meant to serve at home, tending to the needs of husbands and children, and that they didn't have the intellectual capacity to comprehend as a male anyway, so women didn't go to school. And there were no schools for slaves or free blacks at all. So the only people that were really getting an education were people that had children of planters, but mainly the only ones that got an education. In 1798, the Mississippi Territory was surveyed and divided into townships. which were further divided into sections. The income from the lease of every 16th section in the township is called a 16th section fund. And what these funds did, they were used to support local schools. So the leases that were paid, that money that was being paid, funded schools. And Franklin Academy was the first public school established in Columbus in 1821 that was supported by those funds. The Chickasaw Secession of 1832, when that war ended and we got the land, that land was not divided into townships and sections. So the government set aside those acres of lands to be used to build more public schools. And we also had a couple counties established within the Chickasaw Secession, and they got school funds as well. When Mississippi became a state in 1817, we were granted land to build a university, and by 1844, at Oxford, Ole Miss was built. In 1848, it was finalized and named Ole Miss. Mississippi's Constitution of 1817, that was our first state constitution. Remember, we had to have a constitution before we became a state. That constitution, our first one, established a labor system called chattel slavery. And what that just meant is that by law and custom, African-American slaves were the personal property of their owners and could be bought, sold, traded, and inherited. So where did slavery even come from? Where did we get this idea? Ancient civilizations of Egypt, Greece, and Rome all practiced human captivity and servitude called bondage. Europeans brought the institution of slavery with them to the New World. So when Christopher Columbus came over, slavery was introduced. The first African-American slaves were brought by the English to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. The French used both Indian slaves and African slaves to till southern soil in Mississippi, but African-American slaves became most used. As slavery became more and more normalized, I guess you could say, they ended up outnumbering whites. Slaves at first made up the minority of Mississippi's population until the 1830s, and when all of that land turned into cotton fields and we became the heartland of the Cotton Kingdom, by 1840, slaves outnumbered whites by quite a bit, actually. And over the next 20 years, the black population just continued to grow faster than the white population. More and more slaves were needed to farm that cotton. A lot of Mississippians back then were actually slave owners, whether they were a large planter, a small farmer, a small planter, they owned some type of slave. There were three types of slaves in pre-Civil War Mississippi, Antebellum, Mississippi. There were field slaves, house slaves, and town slaves. Field slaves were obviously the largest group of slaves and included both men and women. Children began to work at around 5 or 6 years old, and they performed tasks that didn't require, obviously, as much strength and endurance because they were children. But field slaves were assigned to specific jobs, worked long hours, and were under the control of an overseer. So in the off-season between when they weren't harvesting and planting cotton, they performed additional chores. There were also house slaves. House slaves included cooks, housekeepers, butlers, gardeners, carriage drivers, and traveling companions. And then there were town slaves. Town slaves made up the smallest group of slaves, and they obviously, given the name, they lived in towns and cities. Town slaves included carpenters, cooks, butlers, blacksmiths, day laborers, and those who worked in bathhouses and hotels. Most town slaves lived in small enclosed section of town called the slave quarters, rather than in a house of their owner. So they lived in their own little quarter, and they would go to work, and then after work they would have to go back to their quarters. And they were hired or rented out by their owners. So you could own a slave and they send them to live in the city in those slave quarters. And then if someone said, I need a day laborer today to help me in my shop, you would rent out your slave to that person. And town slaves sometimes got to keep a portion of their wages, but a majority of it was kept by their owners. So they were rented out and did all the work, but the owner ended up taking most of, if not all of, the wages that they earned. As far as management and control went, if you remember what we just said is that slaves ended up outnumbering owners. So people who owned more than 30 slaves needed an overseer, and overseers were in charge of enforcing the slave codes and maintaining order. They were the ones that were watching, supervising, and make sure nothing fishy was going on while they were at work. Slave codes restricted slaves in a number of ways, and slaves were also severely and cruelly punished for crimes and misbehavior. There was a clearly defined reward and punishment system on most Mississippi plantations. So if you run away, trouble. Disrespectful, trouble. And the overseer was in charge of that. In 1831, a branch of the American Colonization Society was established. And what that tried to do is assist free black people who desired to return to Africa. And a little over 500 free blacks went from Mississippi to Liberia through this. Most free blacks were descendants of former slaves, but some were freed by their owners or purchased their own freedom, like a town slave who kept those very little wages that they earned to buy their freedom. In 1831, free blacks were actually required to leave Mississippi after Nat Turner led a slave revolt, and if the free blacks had a good character reference from authorities, they could stay. So there was a slave revolt, and they said, okay, if you're a free black, you can't stay here, you're causing trouble. And only if you had a good character reference from an authority could you stay. And then in 1842, a law passed that prohibited the immigration of free blacks into Mississippi. So if you were a free black, you were not allowed to move to Mississippi if you wanted to, because they didn't want too many free blacks in the area because they feared it would cause more revolts. There was actually several prominent free black men in Mississippi at the time, though. William Johnson was one of them. He was a very successful businessman in Natchez, and he owned barbershops, houses, a delivery service, and he actually owned slaves that ran his 1,000-acre of land. So a free black actually owned his own slaves. As far as runaways and resistance goes, they showed resistance to their bondage and mistreatment in many ways, but the most common resistance was slaves running away. The chances of escaping, however, were not that good. They also displayed their hatred by causing fires and neglecting animals and equipment. In extreme cases, they would murder, poison, or do some sort of violence against their owner. But if they really weren't happy, they could cause a lot of damage. They were in charge of running plantations and farms, and if they didn't do their work properly, that could be sabotage. So that was just one of the ways they resisted. So this is section 3. There was something called the Second Great Awakening in the 1830s. In the South is known as the Bible Belt. In Mississippi was called the Buckle of the Bible Belt. Churches were characterized by their intensity and acceptance of the literal interpretation of the Bible. So good and evil, reward and punishment, and heaven and hell, all of that was upheld by churches at the time. Politicians and newspapers also influenced how antebellum Mississippians looked at their world. Just like today, lots of things can be swayed, and you can be tricked by things like politicians and newspapers. Politics brought excitement, but kept people stirred up and constantly, just like today, people bickering about certain candidates and things. It keeps everyone stirred up. And newspapers take sides and exaggerate and don't really offer a common analysis. You can never really find the true story by reading articles even today, because every type of article has some sort of political affiliation. So depending on where you're reading the article from, you could read one thing in one paper and then read the next and it's something completely different. It just all depends on who wrote it. In 1861, Mississippians were advised by their political, religious, and editorial leaders that they face one of two choices. You either submit to the North or secede from the Union and form your own Southern nation. Politicians, religious leaders, they were all like, look, this is all crazy and we're going to keep causing everyone to feel crazy, and we're going to say we need to secede. When we first became a state and when we were admitted into statehood, the Supreme Court ruled that since slavery was already in Mississippi, it could remain there without any question. It was just there and it was going to stay there. The institution of slavery meant that cotton could be produced in greater abundance, quickly, and effortlessly, bringing wealth to owners. So Mississippians thought that slavery was an unfortunate but necessary evil. They thought, yeah, it's probably not the best thing in the world to do, but we have to do it because in order to grow cotton and get rich, we have to have free labor. That's just how they felt. William Lloyd Garrison established an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator in 1831. Abolitionist, remember, means against slavery. So this newspaper was written, and the newspaper condemned the institution of slavery and slave owners, and it angered Southerners and strengthened their defense for slavery. So how we talked about newspapers and things sway people's ideas and opinions and stir them up, this is what this newspaper, The Liberator, did, and it angered a lot of people. This just got a lot more people talking, hey, this makes it look really bad. Slavery maybe isn't good. And whites just kept justifying slavery, saying economic, religious, philosophical, and racial terms, it's justifiable. It's a necessary, but Mississippians defended slavery not as an evil or a necessary evil, but as a positive good at this point. A necessary evil. So, because they thought it was a necessary evil and a positive good, the expansion of slavery into Western territories after the Mexican War was an intense element of debate. This is when we talked about in Chapter 4, Texas and all that type of area in California, and it started getting more and more conflicted. Southerners argued that if slavery was restricted to the South, slaves would fearfully outnumber whites. So just how we talk about slaves outnumbered white populations, this is what it's talking about. It needs to spread so that we can spread out the slavery. They also feared that slave surplus would cause them to lose money. So if there were too many slaves in the state, like the people who owned town slaves couldn't rent them out for as much money because it was so easy to find one, that the cost would go down. So white Southerners thought the expansion of slavery westward was essential to their economic survival. It made no sense. It had to continue spreading. So the American Revolution popularized the belief in natural rights, or those rights granted to all men everywhere, which are endowed by God and nature with the rights of life, liberty, and property. So after the American Revolution, northern states abolished slavery. There was no more slavery anywhere in the North. In the South, slavery was a symbol and focus of many differences between North and South. Even after the American Revolution, the South was like, yeah, no, we're still keeping this. We need this. So the relationship between free states and slave states was at a breaking point. We talked about the Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850. Nothing was working. And then we were approaching a presidential election. The Republican Party nominated Abe Lincoln, and the Democratic Party nominated John C. Breckinridge. The Constitutional Union Party nominated John Bell. Lincoln ended up winning the majority of the votes in the Electoral College and was declared President of the United States. Remember, Lincoln was the Republican Party nominator. So the South and the Democrats weren't very happy. Many Southerners predicted that the South would secede from the Union if Lincoln was elected, and he was elected. So Mississippi was the second state to secede when it adopted the Ordinance of Secession, and the states based its secession on the theory of states' rights. They thought, you can't tell us what to do. We are keeping slavery. You can't make us get rid of it. That was their basis of secession. Most Mississippians believed that the North would allow the South to leave the Union peacefully and just let them go. You don't like slavery and we do, just let us leave. It's no big deal. Let us go. They didn't believe keeping the Union together was worthy of a war. They said, we don't need to fight over this, just let us go. Mississippi Governor John Pettus strongly miscalculated the possibility of a war. He thought, yeah, sure, the Union will just let us leave. We don't need to fight about it. And a civil war occurred, and approximately 600,000 plus Americans were killed because of it. Next chapter, we talk about the Civil War.